Madam President, I've listened to my colleague just now, and I've listened to colleagues over the last weeks. And there are a lot of crocodile tears being shed on the floor of the United States Senate about why we're not doing something, all of which completely ignore the fact that everything we try to do, the folks on that side of the aisle make us take longer and longer and longer than we've ever taken before, because they push every single procedural objection possible, so that even the most routine thing that we try to do on the floor of the Senate requires 60 votes, requires a motion to proceed. The most perfunctory, simple thing requires us to go through every procedural hoop that the parliamentary process can do, because they have consistently pursued a strategy aimed at gridlock. Make Americans see the dysfunction and then blame it on the party in power and run against them. It's the most cynical, craven, and dangerous policy that I've ever seen in the 27 years that I've been here in the Senate. And I regret it for our country. There's a reason that Democrats are standing for a matter of principle against the Ryan budget and against the proposals that our Republican friends keep coming back with, because they're the only party and they are the only people who have consistently stood up and said, we're not going to consider everything. We're just going to give you a tiny little menu, and you got to balance the budget out of spending cuts only. That's all that's in their budget. The only thing in their budget are spending cuts. 12% of the entire budget is all that they've put on the table in order to try to do something responsible about the deficit of our country. We, on the other hand, have consistently said, we'll put everything on the table. Everything. Medicare, Medicaid, reforms, not benefits. We're not going to cut the benefits on people, because you don't have to in order to deal with this problem. But we can reform them. We can certainly be more effective and efficient. And we're prepared to do that. There are a lot of other things that we're prepared to do. Defense spending, wars, a whole series of things. Mr. President, Madam President, last week one of our newest colleagues made a very interesting, and I thought, revealing observation. The senator from Delaware, Chris Coons, who balanced budgets in county government, who took cases all the way to the Supreme Court, who has seen decisions made in the business world as well as in the nonprofit world. He's an enormously capable person, new to the Senate, and he made the observation that some people are actually looking into the language of the 14th Amendment and the debt limit in order to learn whether, and I quote, there might be some way to save us from ourselves. That observation brought home to me how absurd this place must look right now, not just to a new senator who came here with hopes of getting the business of our nation done, but to the average American, to people who invest in the extraordinary mythology that surrounds this great institution we're all part of, greatest deliberative body in the world. You can laugh at that one today. There's an absence of deliberation, a great absence of deliberation, but there's an absence of it. And I think a lot of people are really alarmed by the dysfunction that they see with respect to this great institution. It's extraordinary that we have to look at the language of the Constitution to find possible ways to do what Congress and the Senate are supposed to do on their own. Take tough votes. Look at the tough issues. Make tough decisions. But most importantly, do it in the interests of the United States of America, not in the interests of either party or of some ideology. Here we are, less than 5 weeks from August 2nd. the day the United States government will default on its obligations for the first time in our history. And Washington is still playing the same old political games, a dangerous game of chicken with enormous consequences for our economy and our future in every respect: economic, social, national security. Madam President, I hear this. In recent travel, Senator McCain and I were in Egypt recently. We got people turning to us and saying, hey, how about you guys? Can you get your act together before you're telling everybody else what they ought to be doing with respect to their future? You're promoting democracy. How's your democracy doing back there in the United States? Working out all right now? Washington is stuck, and it's stuck because we've got a few ideologues and some people outside of the United States Senate who cower our fellow colleagues with threats of primaries. People are going to run against them if they move off of the orthodoxy of extremism. And the result is that nothing is happening. Fear has gripped United States senators who raised their right hand and said, I swear to uphold the Constitution of the United States. Well, everyone here, I think, acknowledges that defaulting on our obligations would be disastrous for our country. Everyone here simultaneously says they don't want the default to happen, but here we are with a small minority holding the debt limit hostage to an ideological agenda, saying they will not consider an approach that most observers consider indispensable and reasonable in reaching an equitable solution to our crisis. Now, frankly, the consequences of not doing something are not far off in the future. Every day that we are here not getting this decision made, we are weakening our economy, and we're making our government, and through it our country, look helpless and adrift. And the fact is that it is already having consequences with respect to business decisions. Capital is holding back. Business people are reluctant to invest, uncertain of what the budget of the United States is going to look like, uncertain of what kind of signals we will send to the marketplace. I mean, certainty, I keep hearing colleagues say we have to send certainty. But when they look at this chaotic debate, what kind of certainty could any business person possibly take from what is not happening in Washington today? Our friends on the other side of the aisle say they want to create jobs, but Moody's chief economist, Mark Zandi, has said that hiring is only going to resume if we can get our act together and settle this debate, and the sooner the better. At the beginning of the month, Moody's announced that it might downgrade our country's credit rating if Congress isn't able to come to an agreement by the middle of July. That's a week away. And if that happens, I promise you our economic recovery is going to halt in its tracks. Maybe some people want that. I hope not. But today, investors are looking at the scene here in Congress, and they're wondering if we're ever going to get it together. And the longer we wait to get serious, the higher the interest rates are going to move. And that hurts everyone in America. Everyone who owns a home or runs a small business is going to be squeezed while Congress is in this ideological standoff. Now, you read David Brooks's column this morning in the New York Times, a brilliant column, talking about the unreasonableness of this position, that something is absolutely off the table with respect to this discussion. Recently, 235 economists, including 6 Nobel Prize winners, sent a letter to congressional leadership urging them to raise the debt limit immediately. Not doing so, they said, could have a substantial negative impact on economic growth at a time when the economy looks a bit shaky. In a worst case, it could push the United States back into recession. So are we going to listen to 235 economists, including 6 Nobel Prize winners, or are we going to be driven by this extremist position that does not allow for reasonable discussion about what ought to be on the table? I think this is a dangerous and irresponsible moment in our country. Not raising the debt limit would result in a crisis potentially far more severe than the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. The consequences would include any number of things, from increases in state and local government borrowing costs, increases in corporate borrowing costs, including mortgage interests, declines in equity prices and home values, declines in 401ks and other retirement savings, reductions in the willingness of investors here and around the world to invest in the United States, and job losses on a significant scale. Now, as I've said, you know, Madam President, I don't believe that's going to happen, but the question is, are we going to get a deal that hurts America or helps America? If we eat America's seed corn in this deal, by that I mean don't invest in America's infrastructure, don't invest in education, don't invest in the research and development that's so critical to the creation of new jobs. If all we do is do what the other folks in the House said we ought to do by massively just looking at 12% of the budget and cutting spending, if that's all we do, we will eat America's seed corn. And the next generation will pay the price, because we will go into an economic downslide unlike anything we have seen in recent memory. In 1983, President Reagan wrote, "The denigration of the full faith and credit of the United States would have substantial effects on domestic financial markets, on the value of the dollar and exchange markets, and the nation can ill afford such a result." And nearly 30 years later, we are facing that kind of incalculable damage. The fact is, Chairman Bernanke and Secretary Geithner have already used extraordinary measures to try to keep the nation from default and keep the economy moving. I'm not going to talk more at this time about the downside effects of it, but I believe there are better choices that we face. This is not half as complicated as some have chosen to make it. In fact, I don't think we're as far apart in this debate when you talk to a lot of our reasonable colleagues on the other side of the aisle, as some want to imply. Everybody can agree deficits are too high. We can all agree we shouldn't be borrowing 40 cents on every dollar that we spend. We can all agree we need about $4 trillion in deficit reduction to put us on a sustainable path. But in the end, this budget debate cannot be just about cutting spending, even though it must include cutting spending. Everyone has said that job creation and investments in clean energy, infrastructure, and medical research are essential. And I think we need to do the things that would make our economy move. Let me give an example of this. In America today, we are living off of the investments that our parents and our grandparents made. The interstate highway system didn't just sprout up one day. It was a government program investing taxpayer dollars in building a nationwide road system that helped America to grow and be unparalleled in its strength compared to any other nation in the world. That was a President Eisenhower program. And the truth is that today we are falling further and further behind other nations in terms of our investment in the infrastructure of the future. The United States is spending less than 2% of its GDP on infrastructure. Compare that. China is spending 9% of GDP on infrastructure. Europe is spending 5% of GDP on infrastructure. They have trains and airports and other things that work and get people faster than our trains where they want to go. We're looking at a country now that has about a $2.2 trillion deficit in the infrastructure of our nation. We've got 69,000 plus bridges that are structurally deficient. We need to invest in them so they don't fall down, like the bridge over the Mississippi River. We need to invest in our airport structure so we don't have airport delays or potential of collisions in our aircraft. According to one study, $1 billion in investment in infrastructure results in 18,000 jobs. So at a time when America is begging for more jobs, why would we not be investing in infrastructure in this country? You go to Germany or Brazil, they're investing huge amounts in their future. And right now, both countries are threatening to leave the United States behind with respect to alternative and clean energy investments of the future. Now, millions of Americans know that we can do a lot better, frankly. In the 1980s, you couldn't find more three ideologically different people than Tip O'Neill, Bob Dole, and Ronald Reagan. But they put politics aside and they saved Social Security. And they didn't capitulate, they compromised. They found the common ground. They did it because they knew America's future was more important than either party. Now, I often hear my colleagues on the other side of the aisle only talking about the spending problems of the country. Madam President, could I ask how much time I have used?
The senator has used 14 minutes.
Thank you. I often hear my colleagues talking about the spending problem, but what they forget about is we had a surplus that we created in the 1990s by making the tough decisions. We invested in the future of our country and we created 23 million new jobs. And in the 1990s, when we balanced the budget, let's not forget that. Some of us were here and made those tough votes, and we balanced the budget. And we created 23 million jobs. Every income level in America went up, every single income level. And we did it at a time, Madam President, when the total relationship of spending to GDP was exactly where many of us believe we ought to take it today, somewhere around 21 or 22%. The fact is that it was President Bush's tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans that we couldn't afford, and a war that he refused to pay for in Iraq and then Afghanistan, or Afghanistan then Iraq, both wars totaling well over $2 trillion. That will ultimately, both of those, the tax cuts and the wars, account for about $7 trillion in deficits in 2009 and going forward. Now, Madam President, the facts are clear. The tax cuts that President Bush put in place contributed to the deficit, and the revenues have got to be addressed if we're going to go forward and deal with this. Federal revenues today, the money the government takes in, is at its lowest level since 1950. We've had a 60% reduction in revenue and a 60% increase in expenditures. And right now, we're at the lowest level of revenue taken in that we've been at since the 1950s. And they're only about 14% of the total GDP. The fact is that the last 5 times we balanced the budget, those revenues were about 19 or 20% of GDP. So here we are at 14%. We've balanced the budget 5 times previously, and the revenues were at about 19.5 to 20% of GDP. Doesn't that tell us something? Now, there's another problem that we have. It's right here on my desk. We have a tax code. The tax code has 8 volumes, over 72,500 pages. This is the Internal Revenue Code, 4,052 pages. I would ask any American, do you have your own page in this tax code? How many Americans have their own page in this tax code? Well, I got news for you. 72,500 entities, a lot of businesses, have found a way to get their little break in the tax code. Last month, the Senate, by a vote of 73 to 27, sent a clear signal that we ought to start looking at some of these subsidies. This entire tax code is riddled with special deals, which lobbyists have worked against the interest of average Americans in most cases. Let me give you a couple of examples. Section 168 in this code has a special rule for racehorse depreciation. How many folks in America are worried about their racehorse today and the depreciation on it. But they've got a provision in here that allows the depreciation of racehorses to go from 7 years to 3 years. And those difference of 7 years to 3 years costs the average American money. The average American is supporting that because it's a foregone revenue. We're giving away the revenue and we're giving it back to somebody who doesn't fundamentally need it. The tax code includes a definition of 3-year property. Get this, any horse other than a racehorse which is more than 12 years old at the time it is placed in service. I mean, who writes this stuff? Where does this come from? Not only is that a waste of taxpayer money, it makes the tax code more complex. It requires more regulations and more confusion. A lot of tax lawyers love these 8 volumes, but the average American ought to be furious at these volumes because these volumes are stealing America's opportunities in a host of other choices that we could be making, like education, investment in energy, energy independence, taking care of our veterans, doing a whole bunch of things that are substitutes for some of the choices that are made. Let me give you a couple of other examples. On April, here's a provision. It's included in one of the regulations. On April 2000, E acquires a horse to be used in E's thoroughbred racing on October 1st, 2003. F buys the horse from E and will use the horse in F's horse breeding business. The use of the horse by E in its racing business prevents the original use of the horse from commencing with F. Thus, F's purchase price of the horse does not qualify for the additional first-year depreciation deduction. I mean, how ridiculous can it get that we're getting into specific cases like that which run contrary to the sort of common sense of average Americans? You know, you got to be able to afford a lobbyist to be on one of these pages. Last year, more than $3.5 billion was spent on lobbying in Washington, D.C. And there are more than 13,000 lobbyists trying to influence the legislation in Washington. And believe me, it works. Look at the last 50 years. And, you know, back in 2004, we passed a bill which the New York Times described as including, this is quote, goodies for almost every kind of corporation. And that, quote, perhaps the most amazing provision might be called the Foreign Gambler Relief Act. Under prior law, if you're lucky and you win big at the horse or dog track, your winnings are subject to a withholding tax. Kind of logical. But now, foreigners don't have to pay tax on their winnings. They found a lobbyist and they got it in the tax code and we passed it somehow. Section 872 of the tax code excludes gross income excludes from gross income, quote, income derived from wagering transactions in certain parimutuel pools. It especially says gross income derived by a non-resident alien individual from a legal wagering transaction initiated outside the United States in a parimutuel pool with respect to a live horse race or dog race in the United States. Now, until I read this, I wasn't absolutely certain what a parimutuel pool was, but I do know that a provision like that does not get in here without lobbying, and it comes at the expense of a lot of other choices. Because the problem is all these breaks in here, whether it's subsidies for oil, subsidies for gas exploration, which made sense 60 and 70 years ago. But here we are with record profits coming into these companies. $35 billion of profit just for the last quarter, 3 months. And yet they get a break. And that break comes at the expense of average folks having the school that they deserve, having the road that they want to ride on properly, having decent public transportation. Those are the choices, and those are some of the things that we're fighting for here. Now, one of the other things that we're fighting for, there are a bunch of these. I don't have time to go into all of them now. But let me just say that we need to think hard about what's fair in America. The only tax that President Obama or we Democrats have talked about is the wealthiest people, millionaires, people earning more than $1 million a year. That's about 7,000 plus lucky families and individuals in the United States. All we're doing is talking about asking them, who benefit enormously from the strength of our economy and the strength of our military and all the things we need to do. We're just asking them, is it really too much to go from 36.9% up to 39.6%, which is where they were in the year 2000, before President Bush gave them a tax cut we couldn't pay for? It's not as if they've done badly these last 10 years. The fact is that more wealth has been accumulated in the hands of the smallest part of America, the top 1%, than at any time in America's history. The wealthy today are far wealthier than when we had no income tax and when we had the great names of the 1920s and 30s and the Industrial Revolution, Pierponts, Morgans, Carnegies, Mellons, Rockefeller, and so forth. Much wealthier today. And yet, they're paying far less of their share than at any time in modern history. Here we are with a deficit problem. They're talking about cutting Medicaid. They're talking about cutting Medicare. They're talking about cutting education loans, making it more expensive for kids to go to college. The one thing we desperately need in order to compete with the rest of the world, people who've got a college education. So I don't hear anybody in America saying, hey, make it harder for my kid to go to college. But that's what they're doing in their budget. It's exactly what they do. But they stand up adamantly and say, no way we will allow people earning more than $1 million a year to pay anything additional into the system. It's just wrong. It's morally wrong. It's repugnant that in this country we are condoning the institutionalization of a larger and larger gap between the haves and the have-nots, between the people who've already gotten their brass ring and the people who are trying to reach it. That is not the American story. And I believe that we need to fight to have a balanced approach. President Obama and the Democratic proposals that I've seen and we've talked about, and I hope people will hear more about in the next days, give a tax cut to about 98% of America. 98% of America gets a tax cut. The only people we're talking about trying to ask kick in to give some more revenue are people earning the most. If you're earning $500,000 a year today, you would not pay any additional tax on your first $250,000. So on the next $250,000, all you'd pay is $12,000 of additional tax. Let me ask you. No, I will say, Madam President, I know this. There isn't one business person, there isn't one millionaire for whom $12,000 will change one consumer purchase, one decision of investment, not one. And all this talk about how it will slow down the economy or hurt America is just bunk. It's not true. So we need to have a real discussion. We need to have a real effort here that I think matches the greatness of this institution with this moment. This can be the world's greatest deliberative body, but we need to put all of these issues on the table. We need to debate them openly. We need to have the courage of our convictions, vote up or down, and do what is needed to put our country on track. Because right now, we are losing countless investment opportunities, countless job opportunities, and if we don't make the right choices here, we are going to have a very difficult time living up to the promise that all of us hope to live up to in our time here in this office. I thank the chair. I ask unanimous consent that full text be placed in the record as if read in full.
Without objection.